Most people still believe in effort. That isn't what changed. People still work, still study, still plan, still save, still sacrifice, still wake up early, still stay late, still try. From the outside, the machinery of ambition remains intact, which makes a certain psychological shift difficult to notice, because the shift did not happen in behavior. It happened in expectation. For a long time, modern life operated through a simple promise, not a written promise, not a formal agreement, a psychological one. If you work hard enough, something better would eventually arrive. Maybe not immediately, maybe not next year, but eventually, the present carried the cost. The future carried the reward. That arrangement organized enormous amount of human behavior. People tolerated uncertainty because they trusted direction. People accepted sacrifice because they believed it led somewhere. The destination mattered. But perhaps even more important, people trusted the path. The relationship between effort and outcome was never perfect. It never guaranteed success. Yet it felt reliable enough. Reliable enough to motivate. Reliable enough to endure. Reliable enough to build a life around. And for decades, many people did exactly that. They delayed gratification, delayed comfort, delayed freedom, delayed enjoyment, because the future was not simply a period of time. It was a promise that sacrifice would eventually become stability, that patience would eventually become security, that effort would eventually become progress. Not guaranteed progress, expected progress. An expectation shapes behavior more than people realize. Human beings do not move toward certainty. They move toward probability. The belief that something is likely enough to justify the cost. That belief matters, because without it, many forms of sacrifice become difficult to sustain. And perhaps that is where something subtle began changing. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, across years, across industries, across generations, across countless individual experiences. People began noticing something difficult to articulate. The promise still existed. The confidence didn't. That language remained. The trust weakened. People still heard the same messages. Work hard. Be patient. Stay committed. Keep building. Keep investing. Keep preparing. Yet increasingly, many people seemed less certain that the traditional sequence would unfold as expected. Not because they became lazy, not because they became cynical, because reality kept introducing exceptions. And exceptions have a peculiar effect on belief. One exception changes nothing. 1,000 exceptions change everything, especially when they begin appearing in unrelated places, different careers, different industries, different cities, different lives. The pattern became difficult to ignore. A man graduates from college, takes on debt, builds skills, finds a respectable job, does everything he was told to do, then discovers that a salary that once represented stability now barely keeps pace with the cost of living. The apartment grows more expensive. The groceries grow more expensive. The insurance grows more expensive. The future grows more expensive. The map remained the same. The terrain changed. And that distinction changes behavior. Because when we trust weakens, adaptations begins. Humans always adapt, not dramatically, psychologically. The adaptation rarely announces itself. It arrives as small adjustments, small recalibrations, small reductions in emotional investment. People still make plans, but they hold them more loosely. People still pursue goals, but they attach less certainty to them. People still imagine the future, but they imagine it more cautiously. Not because they lost hope, because they lost predictability. And predictability is more important than optimism. Human beings can tolerate uncertainty surprisingly well. What becomes difficult is uncertainty combined with expectations. The expectation that life will follow a particular sequence. The expectation that effort and outcome remain connected. The expectation that the future will honor the bargain. And increasingly, many people seem less certain about that bargain. Not angry, not defeated, less certain. That distinction matters, because this is not a story about collapse. It is a story about adaptation, a collective adaptation. One that appears almost everywhere once you begin noticing it. Consider the modern workplace. For decades, careers were imagined as ladders. You entered, you performed, you advanced. The relationship seemed clear. Today, many professionals continue performing at a high level while privately questioning the structure itself. Entire departments disappear. Companies reorganize. Promotions freeze. Years of loyalty can be erased by a quarterly report. A person can spend a decade becoming valuable and still discover that value and security are not the same thing. And perhaps that is why loyalty feels different now. Not because people became less committed, because commitment no longer feels like protection. And when enough experiences accumulate, people begin adjusting their expectations. Not consciously, emotionally. The remarkable thing is that most people rarely talk about this directly. Instead, it appears indirectly. In hesitation, in caution, in shorter planning horizons, in the growing appeal of flexibility, in the preference for optionality, in the desire to remain adaptable. These behaviors are often interpreted as cultural changes, but underneath they may be something simpler, a changing relationship with the future itself. Because the future once functioned as motivation, it functions as uncertainty. That is a profound shift, because motivation requires trust, not complete trust, enough trust. Enough confidence to invest years into outcomes that do not yet exist. Enough confidence to believe the delay still makes sense. And perhaps that confidence has become more fragile than it once was. Not absent, fragile. The difference is important. And then another variable entered the picture: technology. For generations, people worried about competing with other people. Now, many are being asked to compete with systems, algorithms, automation, artificial intelligence. Whether those fear-proof justify is almost secondary. Psychologically, The effect is already visible. The rules feels less stable. The future feels more difficult to model. The timeline feels less predictable. For generations, uncertainty existed. But people believed they could roughly predict the future. Increasingly, prediction itself feels less reliable. And when prediction weakens, long-term planning changes. A person can continue investing effort while quietly reducing expectation. A person can continue following the path while wondering whether the destination still exists. That contradiction may define much of modern life. Meanwhile, something else happened. A symbol of stability began drifting farther away. Home ownership. A house was never just a house. It was proof. Proof that effort was accumulating. Proof that sacrifice was working. Proof that the future was arriving. And when proof becomes harder to find, trust becomes harder to maintain. Today, many people earn incomes that would have impressed previous generations, yet remain uncertain whether they will ever own what earlier generations often considered ordinary. The issue is not merely financial, it is psychological. Because when major milestones become less attainable, the mind begins reassessing the assumption that once supported sacrifice. People were still following the map. They simply stopped trusting the destination. And perhaps that is why so many people feel a subtle form of emotional distance from the future. Not because the future disappeared, because trust changed. Trust is rarely noticed when it exists. Only when it weakens, you notice trust when you begin double-checking, when you begin hesitating, when you begin protecting yourself from disappointment before disappointment arrives. And perhaps an entire generation has been quietly doing exactly that. Not through rebellion, not through refusal, through adaptation, through reduced expectation, through cautious optimism, through emotional hedging, through a smaller assumption about what tomorrow owes them. One adaptation is expectation reduction. People lower emotional exposure. They become more cautious about imagining outcomes, more cautious about certainty, more cautious about long-term assumptions. Not because they were pessimists, because disappointment teaches efficiency. Eventually, people learn not to emotionally spend what they have not yet received. Another adaptation is reversibility, the desire to keep options open, to avoid becoming trapped inside commitments that assume a predictable future. Flexibility becomes valuable, not because flexibility is inherently superior, because predictability feels weaker. People switch careers more easily, change cities more easily, leave companies more easily, question long-term commitments more easily, not because commitment lost value, because uncertainty gained influence. And perhaps the most important adaptation is this: people stop measuring progress the same way. For generations, progress implied movement toward something, a destination, a milestone, a future state. Increasingly, progress often feels like maintaining position, avoiding regression, preserving stability, holding ground. That shift sounds small. Psychologically, it changes everything, because maintenance creates a different emotional experience than construction. Construction generates anticipation. Maintenance generates vigilance. Construction imagines tomorrow. Maintenance protects today. And many people seem increasingly familiar with maintenance, not because they choose it, because adaptations follows conditions. Humans adapt to environments. Then they begin calling those adaptations normal. That may be why this shift feels so difficult to describe, because it does not appear dramatic, not obvious collapse, no singular event, no moment where the promise officially ended. The promise remains visible. What changed is confidence. Confidence that the future will keep its side of the bargain. Confidence that sacrifice still translates the way it once seemed to. Confidence that the path remains reliable. The future didn't disappear. Reciprocity did. The remarkable thing is that most people continue functioning, continue planning, continue striving, continue building lives. The adaptation is not visible in behavior. It is visible in atmosphere, an atmosphere that many people recognize instinctively. A feeling that the old bargain no longer feels as solid as it once did. The effort remains. The future remains. The promise remains. What changed is how many people trust the connection between them. And perhaps that is the recognition hiding underneath all of this. People did not stop believing in effort. People did not stop believing in progress. People did not stop believing in the future. Something quieter happened. They stopped assuming the future would keep its promises. And once that assumption weakens, everything begins to feel slightly different. Plans feel different. Sacrifice feels different. Patience feels different. Ambition feels different. The future itself feels different. Not because it disappeared, because trust quietly left first. The strange thing is that people never stopped moving. They never stopped working. Never stopped building. Never stopped trying. What disappeared was something far more important. The assumption that tomorrow would reward today's sacrifice. The future still exists. The effort still exists. The ambition still exists. But somewhere between them, something fractured. No announcement, no ceremony, no official ending. Just a slow accumulation of experiences that made the old bargain feel less certain. The map still exists. The road still exists. The destination still exists. But an increasing number of people seem to be walking the same path, with less certainty that it leads where they were once told it would. And perhaps that is one of the defining psychological adaptations of modern life. Not that people stopped moving forward, but that they learned to move forward, without fully trusting the promise that once made the journey feel certain.